She helped him steal everything my father built. I let her think she'd won. The light was on under the door. I heard her laugh before I touched the handle. Not the laugh I knew. Something looser, something that didn't belong to me. And in the half second before I turned that handle, I already understood that everything was about to change. I just didn't know yet how much there was to lose. That was a Friday night in November. 3 years later, Claire would show up at my shop in Atlanta holding legal papers she thought would finally break me. She had no idea I'd been watching the whole thing collapse from 1,000 miles away. She had no idea I'd already won. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 46 years old. And the story of how my wife and my business partner tried to steal everything my father left me, and how I made sure they never saw me coming, starts in that parking lot, with the engine running and my hands completely still. My father, Raymond Webb, spent 31 years building Webb Auto and Fleet from nothing. He started with a single service bay in Knoxville, Tennessee, working nights and weekends while my mother worked double shifts at a diner. By the time I was old enough to hand him tools, the shop had expanded to 2 locations and a fleet maintenance contract with the county. When he died of a heart attack at 62, he left me the business, the building, the contracts, and a handwritten note that said, "Take care of it. It's not just a shop. It's proof we were here." I was 38 years old and I had never felt the weight of anything more in my life. I met Claire 9 months after the funeral. She was a marketing consultant, sharp, ambitious, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately started calculating its value. I was still raw from losing my dad, still figuring out how to run a business I'd inherited but never truly led. She was the first person in a long time who made me feel like I wasn't behind. We got married 2 years later. Small ceremony. Her family, a few of my guys from the shop. My father wasn't there, but I kept his note in my jacket pocket. For a while things were good. The shop was growing. Claire helped with the branding, the website, a few commercial contracts I never would have landed on my own. She had real skills. I trusted her judgment. That was the first mistake. About 4 years into the marriage, Claire introduced me to Derek Sims. He was a business consultant she'd apparently worked with on previous clients. Mid-40s, always in a blazer, the kind of guy who talked about leverage and scalability, like other people talk about the weather. She suggested I bring him in to help modernize operations. I was hesitant. The shop was doing fine, but Claire pushed. "Dad did it one way," she said one night. "You don't have to be him to honor him." I remember that sentence exactly because I think about it now and understand what it really was, the first chisel in the wall. I brought Derek in on a consulting basis. Within 6 months, he was everywhere. He'd restructured our vendor contracts, renegotiated the county fleet deal, and was pushing hard for me to formalize his role with equity. Skin in the game, he called it. You want someone who's invested. Claire backed every recommendation he made, every single one. I didn't see it yet. I was too busy running the shop. The night I saw them together, I almost missed it. It was a Friday in November. I'd gone back to the shop around 10:30 to grab a folder I'd left in my office. I had an early meeting with an insurance broker the next morning. The parking lot was empty except for Derek's Audi and Claire's SUV. I figured they were finishing up some presentation she'd mentioned. The main bay was dark. I went in through the side door and walked toward the back office. The light was on under the door. I heard her laugh before I touched the handle. Not the laugh I knew. Something looser. Something I hadn't heard in years. I opened the door. I won't describe what I saw in detail because it doesn't matter. What matters is that it was unmistakable. Claire had time to say my name once before I closed the door behind me and walked back out to my truck. I sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes. I didn't go back inside. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there with the engine running, looking at the sign my father had put up himself. Webb Auto and Fleet, white letters on dark green, and I thought about the note he left me. When I finally drove home, I went straight to the guest room and locked the door. Claire came home around midnight. She knocked twice. I didn't answer. She tried the handle, found it locked, and after a long silence, I heard her walk away. I lay there in the dark and made myself a promise. I was not going to react. I was not going to explode. I was going to think. The next morning, I called in a favor from an old friend. Greg Harlan had been my father's accountant for 20 years and had stayed on to help me through the transition. He was in his 60s, methodical, the kind of man who considered everything twice before speaking. I called him at 8 in the morning, told him I needed a quiet review of the business finances, every account, every contract modification, every equity arrangement Derek had proposed or touched. I told him I needed it handled carefully, and I needed it fast. "How bad do you think it is?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "I just know something's wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll start today." I also called a lawyer I'd used for contract work, Patricia Osei, a small firm downtown, sharp and discreet. I told her I needed to understand my exposure if I discovered someone had been structuring business arrangements to dilute my ownership without my full understanding of what I was signing. She told me to come in that afternoon and bring everything. When I got home that evening, Claire was waiting in the kitchen. She'd clearly been rehearsing. She was calm. I'll give her that. She said it had only happened a few times, that it was nothing serious, that she'd been feeling disconnected from me for a long time, that we could fix it. She used phrases like, "We've both been absent," and "I take responsibility for my part." I sat across the table and I listened to every word with my hands folded and my face completely still. When she finished, I said, "I need a few days to process this." She reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. I didn't want her to know where I was going. Greg called me 4 days later. His voice was different on the phone. Tight, careful. "Marcus, I need you to come to my office, not the shop. My office." I cleared my afternoon and went. He had spreadsheets printed out across his conference table. He walked me through it methodically, the way my father always said he did. No drama, just numbers. What he'd found was a structure that had been assembled quietly over about 18 months. Derek had proposed a series of operational restructuring moves, each one modest enough to seem routine. Vendor payment accounts rerouted through a management LLC Derek had created, a consulting fee arrangement that had ballooned without formal renegotiation, and, the one that made my stomach drop, a proposed equity agreement, drafted by Derek's lawyer, that I had initialed in a stack of documents the previous spring, believing it was a vendor compliance update. I owned Webb Auto and Fleet outright, or I had. That document, buried in a pile of routine paperwork Claire had prepared for my signature, had granted Derek a 24% stake in the business, a stake that, under the terms of the agreement, could trigger a buyout clause if I ever missed more than 90 days of certain operational benchmarks. Benchmarks Derek himself had been quietly manipulating. I sat very still while Greg explained what it meant. Then I asked him one question. "Is there anything here that's irreversible?" He looked at me across the table. "Not yet, but you'd need to move fast." I went straight to Patricia's office. She read Greg's summary for 20 minutes without saying a word. Then she looked up and said, "We can fight this, but if you want to fight it quietly and win completely, you need to stop reacting and start building a record." I told her I had no intention of reacting. She recommended a forensic accountant, a woman named Sandra Cho who specialized in exactly this kind of embedded financial manipulation. Sandra was meticulous and thorough and had no patience for anything she couldn't prove on paper. Over the next 3 weeks, while I came home every evening, ate dinner across from Claire, and made small conversation about the shop, Sandra and Greg were building a documentation trail that would eventually become a 56-page report. What they found was worse than I'd thought. Derek had been funneling money from the fleet contract through his management LLC for over a year. Claire had co-signed 2 of the rerouting authorizations. Whether she'd done it knowingly or been manipulated herself, I couldn't say for certain. But the pattern was there, and the equity document, the one I'd signed without reading carefully enough, had a forged addendum attached, a page I'd never seen, that expanded Derek's role and accelerated his timeline to majority control. Greg called it the cleanest con he'd ever seen assembled on a small business. He did not mean it as a compliment. That night I came home to find Claire had made dinner. Not takeout, she'd actually cooked. Pasta, candles on the table. The kind of effort that in a different life would have meant something. She was standing at the stove when I walked in, and she turned around with a careful smile I recognized immediately for what it was, an attempt to reset the temperature in the room. "I thought we could eat together," she said. "Like normal." I set my keys on the counter. "Sure," I said. We sat across from each other for 40 minutes. She talked about a client meeting, about a friend of hers who was getting married, about maybe taking a trip somewhere warm in the spring. I answered when she asked me something directly. I refilled my water glass twice. I cleared my plate. At no point did my face change. When she reached across the table and touched my hand, I looked at her fingers resting on mine. I thought about Greg's spreadsheets. I thought about the document I'd initialed without reading. I thought about the note my father left me, sitting in a drawer 3 feet from where Derek Sims had been signing paperwork for 18 months. Then I looked up at Claire and said, "That was good, thank you." She searched my face for something. Anger, accusation, anything she could respond to. There was nothing there to find. I stood up, carried my plate to the sink, and told her I had an early morning. She watched me walk upstairs. I heard her blow out the candles a few minutes later. I also hired a private investigator. His name was Tony Marsh. Ex-law enforcement, quiet, good with surveillance. I didn't need proof of the affair for my own sake. I already knew what I'd seen, but I needed to understand the full picture. How long, how calculated, and whether Claire had known from the beginning that Derek was systematically taking apart the business. Tony had photographs and phone records within 10 days. They'd been together for almost 2 years. The timeline overlapped almost exactly with Derek's first equity proposal. I sat alone in my truck in the parking lot of a gas station and looked at those photos for a long time. Not because I wanted to punish myself, because I needed to feel the full weight of it before I decided what to do next. Then I called Patricia and said, "I'm ready." The next 6 weeks were the quietest, most deliberate weeks of my life. Patricia filed to void the equity agreement on the basis of fraudulent misrepresentation, specifically the forged addendum, which Sandra had traced through metadata back to a document edited on Derek's personal laptop. That filing triggered an automatic injunction preventing Derek from exercising any rights under the agreement while the matter was under review. In parallel, I dissolved the management LLC arrangement by invoking a clause Derek himself had written into the original consulting contract, a termination provision that required only 30 days' notice and returned all vendor accounts to direct Webb Auto and Fleet Control. He'd written it as a formality, never imagining I'd use it. By the time Derek's lawyer called Patricia to discuss next steps, there were no next steps. The equity was void. The LLC was dissolved. The vendor accounts were restored. The forensic report had been filed with the court, and a copy had been sent to the Tennessee Secretary of State for potential fraud review. There was nothing left to take. I served Claire with divorce papers on a Thursday morning. I had already moved the personal accounts. I had already spoken to our shared accountant and restructured what was mine under the business. I left her the car she drove and the furniture she'd picked out. I kept my father's desk and the sign from the original Knoxville location, which I'd kept in storage. That evening, I loaded my truck, put the dog in the passenger seat, and drove south. I'd been offered a position consulting with a commercial fleet company in Atlanta, a referral from one of the county contacts I'd kept through the restructuring. I took it. I needed income while I figured out what came next, and I needed distance while the legal process ran its course. I rented a one-bedroom apartment in Decatur, Georgia, put my father's desk against the wall by the window, took the dog for long walks in the mornings, did my work, waited. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Claire did not contest it. Her lawyer likely told her there was nothing to contest. I had documentation, Tony's photographs, and the forensic report. She got what the settlement specified and not a dollar more. Derek's situation took longer. The fraud review stretched into a civil suit. His lawyer negotiated a settlement that included full repayment of diverted funds plus penalties. He did not admit wrongdoing publicly, but the amount he paid back was substantial. I donated a portion of it to a workforce training program my father had quietly supported for years. It felt right. A year after leaving Knoxville, I started looking at commercial real estate in Atlanta. There was a service bay in East Atlanta, former independent shop, good bones, underserved neighborhood. I bought it, spent 2 months renovating it myself on weekends, the way my father used to. Hired 2 mechanics I trusted, landed a fleet contract with a logistics company based in College Park. I named it Ray's Fleet and Auto. I had his note framed behind the front desk. Take care of it. It's not just a shop, it's proof we were here. I also met someone. Her name was Diane. She was a structural engineer who'd come into the shop with a company van that needed brake work. She was direct and funny and completely uninterested in impressing anyone. We had coffee once, then dinner. Then a few weeks later, she showed up at the shop on a Saturday morning with 2 coffees and no explanation, and we spent 3 hours talking in the parking lot while my guys worked inside. She didn't ask too many questions about my past. When I finally told her everything, the shop, Claire, Derek, the whole sequence, she listened without interrupting. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," or "That's terrible," or any of the things people say when they don't know what else to do. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You kept his sign." I said yes. She said, "That's enough to know about you." 6 months later, she had a drawer at my apartment. A year after that, we stopped keeping track. 3 years after I left Knoxville, I was in my office on a Saturday morning reviewing the month's numbers when my cell phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, the desk phone rang. I picked it up. It was a man who identified himself as working for a process server in Nashville. He said he'd been trying to reach me on behalf of Claire Webb, who had filed a civil claim against me related to the dissolution of a business partnership. I thanked him for the information and hung up. I called Patricia immediately. She'd already received the filing. She read it to me over the phone. Claire was claiming that the divorce settlement had been fraudulently structured to exclude her from assets she was entitled to and was seeking damages. Patricia's voice was calm. She'd heard this kind of thing before. "She's hoping you'll settle to make it go away," she said. "She doesn't have a viable case. The original documentation is airtight. But if she gets a judge who asks for a response, I want to be ready." "Be ready," I said. 2 weeks later, Claire showed up in Atlanta. I don't know how she found the shop. Tony later told me she'd hired someone. She walked in on a Wednesday afternoon, and my front desk tech came back to tell me there was a woman asking for Marcus Webb. I already knew who it was. I walked out front. She looked different, thinner, something careful and exhausted in her face that I didn't remember. She was dressed well, She'd always been good at that. But there was something behind it now that felt like effort, like someone wearing clothes from a life they no longer lived. "Marcus," she said. "Claire." Neither of us moved. My front desk tech had quietly found something to do in the back. The bay doors were open, and I could hear one of my mechanics running an engine diagnostic 2 bays over. Normal sounds, normal afternoon. And Claire standing in the middle of it like a door left open from another time. She looked around at the shop, the bays, the new signage, the framed photo of my father on the wall behind the desk. She looked at it for a moment longer than everything else. "You named it after him," she said. I didn't respond. She said she needed to talk. I told her she could talk to my lawyer. She said she wasn't there about the lawsuit. Her voice shifted when she said it. Something tighter coming in, something that was working hard not to break. Her lawyer had told her the case was unwinnable, she said. She was going to drop it. That wasn't why she'd come. She'd come because she needed me to understand something. She said Derek had manipulated her, that she hadn't understood what she was co-signing, that he'd told her the equity restructuring was something I'd already agreed to in principle, that it was just paperwork, that she was doing me a favor by handling it. She said she'd believed him because she'd had no reason not to. She said the affair had started because she'd felt invisible for years, not just to me, but to herself, and Derek had made her feel seen. She said she knew how that sounded. She said she was sorry. Then she told me where she was now. Derek had left 8 months after the divorce. New client, new city, new woman to work with. The consulting jobs had dried up. Word traveled in that industry, and whatever had come out during the legal proceedings had been enough. The Nashville house had been sold to cover her legal fees. She was renting a 1-bedroom in Murfreesboro. She was 41 years old and starting over with nothing. She said all of this without crying. I'll give her that. She kept her voice steady all the way to the end. I stood there and let the silence sit between us for a long moment. Then I walked back to my office. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the same desk that had been my father's, that I'd carried out of Knoxville in the back of my truck the night I left, and I took out the manila envelope I'd kept for 3 years, not out of spite, not to use as a weapon. I'd kept it the same reason I kept his note. Because some things you hold on to so you never have to wonder whether you imagined them. I walked back out and held it out to her. She looked at it without taking it. "Open it," I said. She did. She went through it slowly. Tony's surveillance report, the timeline, the photographs, Sandra's letter with the sequence laid out plainly, the co-signed authorizations highlighted, the dates circled. She turned each page carefully, the way you read something you already know is going to cost you. When she got to the end, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she looked up at me. "I thought you didn't know," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "I know," I said. "That's why I didn't fight. I didn't need to." She closed the envelope and held it in both hands. She looked at the photo of my father on the wall again. She looked at me one more time, and whatever she was looking for, she didn't find it. "Okay," she said. I walked her to the door. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her back to me, the envelope at her side, the afternoon traffic moving past on Memorial Drive like none of this was happening. Then she walked to her car and drove away. I stood in the doorway until she turned the corner. Then I went back inside, refilled my coffee, and finished reviewing the month's numbers. That evening, Diane came by the shop after her last site visit. We sat on the tailgate of my truck in the parking lot and watched the last light go out of the sky over East Atlanta. She asked how I was doing. I told her about Claire's visit, all of it. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Do you feel like it's over?" I thought about it. I thought about the sign above the bay door, about the note in the frame behind the desk, about the year I'd spent driving south and learning what I was capable of when no one was watching. "Yeah," I said. "It's been over for a long time." She leaned against my shoulder. The dog was asleep in the truck bed. The shop was locked up and clean. My father built something from nothing in a world that didn't make it easy. I lost it once, not because I wasn't paying attention, but because I trusted the wrong people with something I should have held more carefully. But I got it back. Not the same version, a better one. And that, in the end, is the only thing that mattered. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. New episodes every week.